Hey guys, this is Dima from droiddog.com, and today I'll be reviewing the LG Optimus G. With me I have two versions, the AT&T version on the left and the Sprint version on the right. In many ways they are identical, in some ways they are different, but I will be reviewing both since they're very similar. First up is hardware. Both of them have the same display, which is a true HD IPS display at 1280 by 768. It's not the standard 720p resolution, it's actually slightly wider than that, so it gives you a little extra room, but it's not too wide like the old LG Intuition or LG View, depending on where you live. It's a fantastic screen. Then inside is a Snapdragon S4 Pro processor at 1.5 GHz. It's the same quad core as the Nexus 4 uses, and the same quad core as the Droid DNA uses, paired with 2 GB of RAM. And on the Sprint version, there's 32 GB of memory. On the AT&T version, there's only 16, but you get a micro SD card slot under the flap, which comes with a built-in 16 GB SD. So obviously it's much preferable to have that SD card slot. So in that sense, the AT&T version is better. And the Sprint version comes with a 13 megapixel camera, which slightly bulges out of the body, while the AT&T version comes with a flush 8 megapixel camera, which the Nexus 4 adopted. And as you can tell, the design is actually different. The Sprint version more mimics the international version of the Optimus G, and you can't even see any Sprint branding. It just says LG on both sides, and that's it. No Sprint branding. And it has the same sparkly back that all Optimus Gs do, while the AT&T version is wider, rounder sides, ever so slightly shorter, and does have a different sparkly back. It's more of a light gray than the dark, slightly blue tinged on this phone. So they are slightly different in that sense, but otherwise they're very similar. Both phones have pretty much the same design otherwise, the same 3.5mm headphone jack and secondary mic, micro USB port, primary mic, and the two screws that make it look so industrial, a power button and a volume rocker. And the only other difference is, of course, the LED. The LED on the Sprint version is right here somewhere, and the LED on the AT&T version is actually right around the power button. I'm not sure if you can see this, but it does have that ring around it. That ring is the LED, and it glows red. Red seems to be the only color it glows, actually. While we're on the topic of hardware, let's talk about build quality. These phones are built extremely well. They're very solid. All the plastic around the edges does not creak whatsoever. They use a gloss plastic here and a textured matte plastic here, and both sides are glass. They're built really well, and you won't feel any problems with them. However, of course, the questionable part about build quality is the glass back. The glass back is not Gorilla Glass, so it will actually break easier than the front of the phone. And you hear horror stories about people breaking their Optimus G, their Nexus 4, and I'm really afraid that these will not last long just because they're so fragile. They shouldn't be too hard to replace, but you'd have to pay money for that glass, and I think that's just a huge disadvantage. I personally do not want a glass back phone. I'd prefer something more durable, like plastic. You may insult Samsung for building phones out of what you call cheap plastic, but that plastic lasts a long time. And the build quality on these is amazing, other than the questionable glass backs. One thing I thought I should mention is the vibration motor. The vibration motor on neither of these phones is very good. It's not bad by any means, but it's not very good. It's not sharp like Samsung motors. Samsung motors tend to be very sharp and deliver a very short kick, while these are dull and long, so if you type too fast on a keyboard with haptic on, it'll turn into one long vibration, and it's not a big deal for most people, but it's not the best vibration motor out there. However, it has absolutely no issues. Now into software. LG Optimus Gs run a very skinned version of Android 4.0.4. The customizations are not necessarily as heavy as Sense UI. They're not bloated, they're not slow, but you'll notice a really big difference. It's very much like TouchWiz. In fact, it actually rips off a few features from TouchWiz. I guess I should mention that, but it's actually a really nice UI, and you'd be surprised how customizable it is compared to other UIs. Let's take a look. The first thing you'll notice is obviously the lock screen, and it has nice big text for everything, and you notice there's no knob. Very much like Samsung lock screens, you swipe anywhere, and it just opens up, and I think that looks absolutely gorgeous. Same goes for the 4 customizable shortcuts at the bottom, not linked to your dock or anything. You could just set them to whatever you want, and you just slide and it unlocks. Here's their launcher. It has a custom 3D effect, custom widgets. These widgets, for example, Social Plus, the weather, are all LG widgets, so you cannot use them on other launchers. And the notification bar, somewhat like Samsung's, but these notification toggles are really good and they're customizable. You can change them to anything you want, which is fantastic. And the great thing about this is all the settings. If you just hit home screen settings, you could select your home, which is great. I mean, most launchers don't even offer that. Animation, you could change it between all of these. It's really great that they have all these different types of animations. I find that absolutely fantastic, especially for a stock launcher. You could select a lot about the home screen. You could also customize the lock screen. You can change the clock. So I really like this big text clock. You can set it to something so simple, or you can set it to analog, and you can customize your shortcuts. And then the screen effect. Basic is what I showed you. There's Ripple, which is a lot like Samsung Galaxy S3 and Note 2 lock screen. Kinda. And definitely my favorite is Dewdrop. This is what I've been using this entire time. It actually has a really nice 3D effect. And each lock screen has its own custom sounds, so everything is very customizable. And it even has a lock timer. If you lock it and then unlock it before 30 seconds is up, or whatever time you set it to, it will not show the lock screen. Some people might find that very useful. I really don't, but some people may. Now the biggest customization you'll find is in the settings. No longer do you have one list of everything, you literally have tabs. Now this is both good and bad. It takes a little longer to get to some places, but it actually kind of useful for people who like organization. And it offers quite a few settings that are pretty cool. For example, widescreen. Keep screen on when device detects your face looking at the screen. Sound familiar? Smart Stay. I mean, they kind of ripped off a few things, but that's okay. I really don't blame them. Font type, I have it set to Roboto. They include a ton of fonts, but obviously Roboto is my favorite, so I set it there. They didn't take it out, luckily. And notification light, unfortunately, only glows red. So the software on here is great. It's very optimized, surprisingly. It's extremely smooth paired with that quad-core processor. It's fantastic. The browser's smooth. Everything is smooth. Text messaging, the keyboard is not that bad. For example, I have SwiftKey, but the LG keyboard is not that bad. It does turn off autocorrect while you're typing, and if you hit the symbols key, it just turns it off, which is annoying. However, they do include the AOSP keyboard. This only comes on the AT&T version. The Sprint version does not have the AOSP keyboard, but I love the fact that they include it. This is the 4.0 version, no swiping like on 4.2, but it's still a great feature to have. Now there is one issue you face if you want to use some of the LG programs. For example, they have Social Plus. Unfortunately, Social Plus is only a widget, it is not an app, so if you change the launcher you cannot use Social Plus. Social Plus is actually somewhat useful. You can integrate with your Twitter and Facebook and I believe other social accounts, but it's only usable if you use their stock launcher. The stock launcher is nice, and I would suggest people actually give it a shot before dismissing it. I do like it a lot, but it's unfortunate that the widgets are proprietary. Most companies do that, but it's still unfortunate. Now here's something we don't usually talk about, but I think is important: the developer community. If you're willing to risk your phone by rooting it and unlocking the bootloader, unofficially I might add, then you might be interested in this. And of course we do not suggest you risk your phone that way, but I think it's important for people to know. The developer community is actually fairly good. They managed to unlock the bootloader on this phone, and on the AT&T version specifically, there's something called the Nexus 4 conversion. This actually cuts down the 16 gigabyte internal memory to 8, turns off things like the capacitive buttons and puts on-screen buttons, and actually gives you updates straight from Google. It'll make your Optimus G a Nexus 4. Of course, things like LTE will not work, things like the micro SD card will not work. It will literally become a Nexus 4, which is awesome for those people that want it, but I don't think many people would. So it's important to note that it does have a fairly good developer community, so if you're willing to buy it specifically for that reason, you probably should, but again, we don't endorse rooting or modifying phones. Now let's talk about the performance of these phones. With that Snapdragon S4 Pro quad-core processor, these things fly. There's nothing that I have done so far that has bogged them down. Every game I've played, every app I've used has been flawlessly smooth. Smoother than my Note 2, surprisingly. And I've been incredibly impressed with the performance on these phones. I mean, the smoothness is unrivaled by any phone I've ever used, Android or anything else. You can guess what I'm talking about. And the software overlay that LG uses actually does not hinder performance, which is very surprising. I'd think that AOSP would be a little faster, but it doesn't seem that way. Both these phones use the same processor, so have the same performance. Unfortunately, the LG version does have slightly worse performance. It does seem like that the software is a little less optimized. However, the performance is pretty much negligible. There's almost no lag, just that tiny bit. And overall, you'll find the performance absolutely fantastic. The 2 gigabytes of RAM will keep these phones from filling up. You can open up as many apps as you want, and they'll still work just fine. And there's really no reason not to buy this because of performance issues. I think the Snapdragon S4 Pro is probably the fastest CPU on the market right now, except for maybe the soon-to-come Snapdragon 600. Still, these phones are absolutely fantastic in performance. Now, something a lot of people actually worry about a lot in smartphones is battery life, because it is one of the most important things in a phone. If your phone is dead, what uses it to you? So battery life is very important. Now these phones actually have fantastic battery life. I don't know how they do it, but these phones last for a long time. To get into the battery settings, you have to go to power saver and go to the very bottom for battery use. It's a little strange at first to look at this, but this does not indicate how good the battery in this case is because I haven't been using it much, but I've played a few games and I have a screen on time of about half an hour, and it's lasted 3 hours and 30 minutes on 8%. I actually got about 2 days out of it without very much use. I think I had an hour and a half screen on time, but this thing lasts a long time, and texting really does not phase it. And considering this phone is really powerful and made for games, I think you won't be disappointed with the battery life. The battery in here will last a long time despite its not incredible size. I mean, compared to the 3100 milliamp hour battery on the Note 2, this thing is a bit smaller, about 2100 milliamp hours, but it's still fantastic and it lasts much longer than most other phones. Now onto camera. This is where things get a bit sticky. The camera on these phones is not very good. Again, they have two different cameras. The Sprint model has 13 megapixel and the AT&T model has an 8 megapixel camera. Neither of these is anywhere near fantastic. Photos in low light come out blurry, they're not sharp, and I think that even if they were high noise and sharp, they would be better than blurry and low noise. So these photos don't come out very well in low light. In good light, they're not the sharpest photos out there, but they do just fine. I feel like the 13 megapixel camera is slightly sharper than the 8 megapixel camera, but there's very little difference between them. For example, here's the Sprint version, and let me show you some of the photos I've taken. You see something like this is a macro shot of my keyboard. It comes out blurry, slightly, not much, but it came out pretty decently. Then you see photos of my dog, and they're not very sharp, nothing extraordinary whatsoever. So that's something you should keep an eye out for. Here's an outdoor shot in very good light. It's actually fairly sharp. It's a good quality photo, a bit overblown, but it's nothing bad. Definitely, it's a good high-end camera, but it's not great. And for the AT&T model with 8 megapixel camera, it's pretty much the same thing, except things come out a slightly bit blurrier. I took a few more photos with this. The same photo of the keyboard came out even blurrier in low light, and photos outside actually came out fairly sharp and nice, not very overblown. So that's something to look out for. This one actually takes better outside photos than the Sprint model. And both cameras are about equal, even though one does take higher resolution photos. But again, megapixels don't matter. 8 megapixels is perfectly fine for any camera phone, so the quality issue is between the two phones, not the megapixel count, and I'd say the Sprint one edges out slightly, but not by much. The last thing, of course, is connectivity. The AT&T one has HSPA Plus and LTE, while the Sprint one just has LTE. Of course, LTE on Sprint isn't very well rolled out. In some places, I do get LTE just for a brief moment, and unfortunately, LTE speeds have not been that great. In fact, they've been under 1 megabit download. But of course, I'm not in an LTE area. I don't know how I'm getting LTE, but it's right outside of San Francisco, which they announced LTE in pockets. The AT&T version, of course, gets LTE because AT&T's network is far bigger, and the LTE performance has been just as good as my AT&T Note 2. I always get 4 to 5 bars in my area where I used to get none, so AT&T has improved their network significantly, and my speed tests have been pretty decent. They've been nothing fantastic, especially in an area like mine, but they've been definitely good. As you can see, my only speed test right now has been 13 down, 10 up, and I consider that actually very good. Now with the Sprint model, some of these have been on LTE, some of these have been on 3G. As you can tell, the LTE one is the top one at 67 millisecond ping, but I did get only 0.7 down and 0.2 up. The other two have been on 3G, as you can tell, the performance isn't fantastic. However, it's somewhat usable. I am in a fringe area. Most carriers don't get very good signal except for Verizon, AT&T. So it's actually quite surprising that Sprint got signal at all here. As you can tell, I do have 5 bars right now. This is not the usual. I usually get 0 to 5 depending on where I am. It's a huge difference for some reason. But the connectivity for this phone has been as good as pretty much any other phone. It's been making phone calls. It hasn't been dropping calls. And it's actually been very reasonable. However, Sprint's network does suffer from some slowness unlike AT&T's. In conclusion, the LG Optimus G is an absolutely fantastic phone. The display is absolutely beautiful. The blacks aren't as deep as I'd like them to be, even on an IPS panel, but the colors are gorgeous, it's extremely sharp, and has great outdoor visibility. The processor inside just flies, and I love everything about it except for the camera and the glass back. The camera is definitely not bad, but it's not great, and the glass back is very fragile. But this phone will last you a long time if you keep a case on it. I mean, it's a trade-off for beauty. As you can tell, this thing sparkles and attracts a ton of fingerprints. However, it is fragile. So you decide if it's worth the trade-off to you, and if I were you, I'd put on a case. However, these phones are just absolutely amazing and you can't go wrong. They fly, they're insanely fast, and the battery life is fantastic. So if you get it on AT&T or Sprint, I'm sure you'll be very happy. This has been Dima from DroidDog.com, and have a good day.